All right, well, welcome everyone and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today in our chat about cognitive load theory. I know that this may sound a little theoretical and perhaps it's not the most engaging or catchy teaching tip you might think of, but nonetheless, I hope that after today's workshop, you'll have a newly framed or reframed perspective on how you teach, and that some of the teaching tips we will talk about later on today will be applicable to your variety of classrooms. So I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Kevin, and I'm an instructional designer here at the Center for Teaching Excellence. I have been teaching in higher ed for a couple of decades now on site, and then a decade and a little bit more online. And my background in teaching is in language acquisition as well as art history. And I also come to Triton with faculty development and training experience. My current doctoral research interests include project-based learning, as well as creating communities of inquiry in online classes. And Tuan Dean is also joining us today, and a little bit later, he'll be sharing some of his evidence-based practices on math instruction. Tuan is from College Readiness and Math Faculty Department, so he'll be able to share some of his expertise a little bit later on in today's workshop. So let's start off by talking a little bit about our objectives for today. And so by the end of today's workshop, you will be able to define cognitive load theory. You'll be able to identify 3 components that make up cognitive load theory, and then identify general teaching practices that we use to reduce cognitive load. And then finally, we'll conclude by applying these teaching practices to your classrooms and your environment. So I want to give you a heads up along the way. In the next few slides, we're going to be using a lot of terminology. And so we'll have to take some time to work through some of these terms and concepts. And rest assured, this will apply to you. We want to think about cognitive load theory and how it applies to all teaching and learning. It is definitely researched the most in technical fields like mathematics, in science, and in technology. A lot less research has been done, or very limited research has been done, in more creative areas like the humanities, in literature, in history, in art. And this is, of course, of great interest to me as one who's been teaching the humanities for over 15 years, and my entire career has been humanities-based. I have found that so much about cognitive load theory is directly applicable towards my art history instruction. And it's also through language acquisition that I originally learned about cognitive load theory. A little bit earlier this year, Tuan Dean and Tina Bavone hosted a workshop on metacognition. And it was in their workshop on metacognition and motivation that I kept finding myself saying, oh, and that's cognitive load theory. Oh, that's about cognitive load theory. And so through their inspirational workshop, I thought it would be a great next conversation to have about cognitive load theory, since both cognitive load theory and metacognition are interested in mental resources that are used in the learning process. And so as instructors, as faculty, as trainers, as instructional designers, we all have that shared interest. So bear with me. The next few slides are going to be a little bit brainy and perhaps a little bit heady, but we have to get through some of this first to then understand how we're going to apply it to our general practice. So let's start off, though, by just reflecting on a previous academic learning experience that you've had that you found to be very challenging or very difficult. And I'm interested in hearing from you now about what made this experience challenging or what made it difficult. You can type your responses into the chat pod, or of course you can raise your hand or speak up. But I want us to start thinking about a challenging experience. And are there any brave volunteers that can think of something that they remember from an academic, learning experience? I'm going to look at the chat pod here and see what responses you might have, or you can of course just speak up as well. High school chemistry is an experience. Okay, there's a lot to unpack with chemistry as well. And Mary, did you want to speak up?
Oh, sure. How about starting a bachelor's program fully online at the age of 51 and never having used a computer before except for answering emails?
There you go. That sounds like a very intense cognitive challenge on many levels there, for sure. Good. I'm right with you, Mary, believe me. Okay, cool. Great. Thank you for sharing those experiences. And I can, learning statistics, both on site, but also stats online through video instruction. So those are some of my more challenging learning experiences. So, all right, fantastic. So let's think a little bit more here. When you hear the words cognitive load theory, just what associations come to your mind? And again, you can just type into the chat pod here a word or phrase, or again, just speak up if you'd like. But what associations do you have without Googling anything, without cheating? Just what general associations do you have with cognitive load theory? Any ideas? Headache? Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Definitely when we get to these challenging learning experiences, we all feel that way. We all get those headaches. Any other associations that come to your mind when you hear this phrase of cognitive load theory? Being able to understand something, absolutely. Trying to understand something. Okay, good. Anything else? I think I got it. How to handle. It's interesting you said bits of information, so that's good. But how to handle information, right? So bits of information. So we want to come back to that actually. Bits of information. Okay, good. So we're thinking along these lines here. So let's start breaking this down a little bit. When we think about cognitive load theory, everyone, this really came out of the work of educational psychologist John Sweller. And in the 80s, and I included a screen grab here of his paper that he published in the Cognitive Science publication. And in this paper about cognitive science, he talks about cognitive load. And it's really him who relates the amount of information that working memory can hold at any one time. So cognitive load theory relates to the structures and the functions of cognitive architecture. And I love any architectural references. So it's very concrete for me. I understand it. So it's about human cognitive architecture. It asserts that working memory load should be reduced and schema construction should be encouraged. So right there we have, okay, working memory load and schema construction. So we need to just pause on those two phrases, working memory load and schema construction. So when we think about our working memory, we have to start off by teasing this apart a little bit. So working memory is what our brain holds temporarily. And if you do Google this, you will see that an abundance of scientific research, empirical studies have been done that show we can hold, our brain holds about 5 to 9 items. You're going to see 7 plus or minus 2. So we're like somewhere between 5 to 9 bits of information is, what we're thinking about here. And so this is why we have an abundance of books or resources that say, 7 healthy habits for a good lifestyle, or 7 ways to manage your money, things like that, right? This is our working memory. And working memory is temporary. It focuses our attention. When we think about our working memory, this is about really just connecting it to what we already know. Our brain is trying to do that. But as educators, our goal is to move information from working memory into long-term memory. And so let's think a little bit about it, and maybe this visual will help you as well. So when we think about working memory, it's kind of just like being online, but long-term memory is our storage, right? So our brain is building schemas, or these bits of information or chunks of information. And these schemas go into long-term memory. And so our brain is constantly trying to access what you're saying right now, what I'm saying right now, and what you already know. And this is how our brain is working. These are our schema. This is schema construction. And so when we think about schema construction, novices in any subject matter really have little bits of information, or not yet formed, right? Incomplete or not formed at all. Experts, on the other hand, have these nice chunks of information in their brain, these vast schemas or these networks. And so working memory is constantly trying to make these schemas complete. So the bits of information is a good way to think about it for now, since we just use that word bits, right? So when we think about cognitive load, there's a few more things we need to work through here. And educational psychologists have identified there's 3 aspects to cognitive load. We have intrinsic, extraneous, and germaine. And these parts make up total cognitive load. So again, this is where it's going to get a little heady, but then we'll get through this. So let's break down these 3 components: intrinsic, extraneous, and germaine. So when we think about intrinsic cognitive load, intrinsic is the inherent level of difficulty with your subject matter. And this visual, I think, very clearly explains that intrinsic cognitive load is the course contents and just what is inherently challenging, or just the inherent quality of that instruction, right? In addition to the inherent complexity of the subject matter that we're learning about, we also have to think about the intrinsic, or the learner, what the learner already brings to the table, what she already knows about the topic, right? The intrinsic cognitive load is the inherent difficulty of the subject matter and the experience of the learner. This is what we call intrinsic cognitive load. When we think about the extraneous cognitive load, the extraneous cognitive load is the load generated by the way the material is packaged or presented, right? The extraneous cognitive load is something that's totally under control of the teacher. This is like how we present the information to our learners. When we think about the extraneous cognitive load, it, for example, could be a very complex or confusing explanation about how to make a sandwich. We could describe how to make a butter and jelly sandwich and really take 2 pieces of bread, peanut butter, jelly, smash it together. But we could make that very complex too, depending on how we taught it. We could get into the types of bread we want to use. We could get into the quality control of the ingredients of the peanut butter. We could talk about spreading the jam on the bread. We could talk about cutting the bread. Do we leave the crust on or off? I mean, it could get very complex. Doesn't need to be. This is extraneous cognitive load. It's what we bring to how we teach the subject matter. And then we have the germaine cognitive load. So when we think about the germaine cognitive load, and again, I think this visual presents it very clearly for us, we're talking about the learner's active engagement in processing that new material. So again, this visual is reminding us of the intrinsic cognitive load, the inherent difficulty of the subject matter, the way it's presented or packaged, and then the germaine load is the mental work the learner is going through to learn this subject matter. And this is all moving it into our long-term storage. So our germaine load is good. The germaine load is necessary for processing this information. So when we think about the germaine load, it's really about the learner's mental exercises to learn this new subject matter. It aids in understanding the subject matter. The germaine load helps to facilitate schema construction. So those are the three aspects of cognitive load: the intrinsic, the complexity of the new information; the extraneous, the unnecessary or distracting ways we might present information; and then the germaine. This is about the mental activity we do to understand it, the work that we do. All right. So just to make it abundantly clear, new information comes in. We want to decrease that extraneous load so that learning happens. If we overload our brains with complex explanations, if we have too many visuals, distracting visuals, there's a million ways we could make this information complex, and then we shut down as learners. It doesn't go into long-term memory. So this is where we run into any problems. So that was the technical part. Do you have questions so far? I know that was kind of a lot and kind of quick, but any immediate reactions or questions or anything that I should review before we move on to the next phase here? We got our intrinsic, our extraneous, and our germaine. Okay, so if at any point though during today's presentation you do have a question, of course, you can type it into the chat pod or put your hand up and we're good. Okay, great. So now that we've explained these key terms and these concepts, let's move on to some other ways of thinking about this. All right, so let's practice a little bit. Let's experience this. So you have a visual in front of you, and this visual explains cognitive load theory. Same information presented two different ways. So I want you to look closely at this example, these examples, and just think for a second, which example is easier to immediately understand? This is cognitive load theory. You've just heard a little explanation about cognitive load theory, and now you're looking at this visual, and you're trying to understand cognitive load theory. And which one speaks to you? Which one is easier to understand, like immediately, A or B? And I'm seeing, B is easier, right? And so let's look at what's going on here. What's the difference between these two examples? Again, speak up or just chat. What do you notice? And why is B easier? And you're right, B is the better graphic to understand cognitive load theory. What's going on with A that becomes so confusing or difficult? Exactly. So A, you're going back and forth, right? you're going to more than one place to look for that information. So you've never heard about cognitive load theory before, and then, you know, you're trying to understand it. So you're having to go, what's number one? Then you go down to another chart to look for what number one means. And you got to go back to the graphic to apply number one, back and forth and back and forth. So this is problematic, and that this is what's called the split attention. And we'll talk about that. Here's another example, and the point is made clear already. But here's an example from my practice as an art historian. And again, two visuals, they really say pretty much the same thing. Between those two different visuals, there's actually 6 key terms that are exactly the same. So, you know, I've taught Gothic architecture for 15 years, and I have novice learners, never thought about Gothic architecture before. And you cannot teach Gothic architecture without using a whole lot of terminology. And so I asked students to talk about the cultural significance, the architectural significance of a Gothic cathedral. So I'm asking them to do all these things, but I'm also asking them to understand and talk about terminology. So the example on the left or the example on the right. And again, you already can see that the point is made that, oh, well, the example on the left, first of all, has really small print for the key terms that we want to use. The graphic requires you to split your attention between two different places, whereas the image on the right has the terms clearly identified with that portion of the cathedral, and it's consistently color-coded too. So you have a couple different ways that this helps the novice learner immediately know, oh, that's the flying buttress. Oh, that's the pinnacle. Okay, so when Mr. Forman is talking about buttresses, that's what he's talking about. So it's the immediacy, and that helps to, you know, reduce this extraneous load, right? Image A is all about the extraneous load. This is unnecessarily complicated. And image A, by the way, is absolutely found in like every art history textbook. And it was in the textbook that my institution was married to, right? So we used it all the time. It was in all the images, but yet look at how it actually does not facilitate learning for those students, right? For those novice learners. So let's look at another example here, because what I want to do now is just show you how you can apply these ideas to assignments, for example. So again, this is my own example from my art history classes with a compare and contrast essay. So imagine you get this assignment for your compare and contrast essay. And now you know you have this task in front of you, you're already overwhelmed by maybe Gothic terminology, and then you get this essay assignment, or you get this assignment. So again, we can compare the two, and I think you know where this is going. If we look at the example on the right, we can see, okay, well, with this assignment, I know as educators, we want our students to know everything, and it becomes pretty tempting to want to teach them everything. But with this assignment example, I've reduced this extra information, and this is where scaffolding becomes super important. For the assignment, it was simplified significantly so that only the essential information was included. And all this extra information that just actually, although the spirit is to help students by stepping it out more, it's adding to that extraneous load. And so that's preventing the learning from taking place and causes cognitive overload. And then they walk away going, oh, that final art history compare and contrast assignment is so difficult, I can't even handle it. And they shut down. And then this is where all these problems begin. So we want to keep talking about these examples of how we can apply this to the classroom. And so, you know, my colleague Tuan is here today as well from the College Readiness and Math Department. And he'll be talking a little bit more about the worked example effect and how this helps to reduce cognitive load. So Tuan has some examples, and Tuan, I think this would be a good time for you to step in, and you can let me know. I can move through the PowerPoint as you need me to. But Tuan, are you ready to go?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was a little late before the introduction, but for those who do not know me, as my colleague just presented, I am Tuan Dean from the College Readiness and the Mathematics Department. And cognitive load, for me, for all of you, is all about giving enough examples to go along with the instructions, and then also give practice and along with feedback to students so that they know they're going in the right direction. Cognitive load actually goes through several different things in the math department, or doing math in this case. We actually want to make connections to the mathematics so that students understand and how it applies not only in the classroom, but also outside the classroom in the different fields. We also use routines, and this will be that practice and the conversation of where the math is applied and using real world experiences and examples. And we also provide time, well, I provide time to my students to use that practical skill within the classroom, but then also outside the classroom. And I think most of my colleagues in the math department actually do that when we give not a lot of questions for homework assignments, but just a few so that they know, but then also so that they know how it applies to the different fields and areas that they're going into. And in the classroom, I think it's important that we be clear and concise about what we're asking our students to do. And cognitive load actually does that. We don't want to overwhelm them, and we don't want them to feel like the instructions are too long, just like Kevin was saying, and especially with the examples, which are wonderful. And we don't want them to feel that, oh my God, that math is going to be this hard and difficult and challenging subject. And I think would that be for any and all subjects: English, art history, science, chemistry, biology, and you name it. We also want to pay attention to the purpose of what we're doing and how we're doing it for our students as well too. And I think with this information for all of you, it's very important to remember these things, not only with the novice student, but with our expert students as well too. And we don't want to forget about the emotions of what our students come in with, and dealing with problems or dealing with the subject itself, and dealing with any and all type of new learning experiences. If Kevin can go to the next screen. So here I provided an example of what we would do in the classroom for a work problem. And in the beginning, what I'll do for my class, I'll have a picture and I'll ask students, you know, based on their previous knowledge and previous education, how would they apply a work scenario? And this is when two people are working together, or two people working separately, or when an individual in this case is coming in and doing a task by him or herself, and then the next person comes in and actually does the same task. And again, we're talking about these work scenarios. So educators should provide or demonstrate examples, especially when you're dealing with word problems. And that's not only with work problems, but all types of problems. And then give the solutions before learners to try to get some benefit out of it. And again, here's an example, like I said, that we'll do in the classroom and dealing with a work scenario problem where you have two people working separately, and now we want to find out the time that they work together. And I usually get a lot of different responses, and I gave the examples of what most students will say. They approach it by adding the two numbers together, which is the individuals who work separately. And then what I think is benefit for my students is to give them a chart, to have them diagram or use a mathematical model to see exactly how to solve the problem or approach the problem. And again, with these different scenarios, especially approaching and understanding mathematics, like I said, it is a lot of times you get a lot of different responses of how students will look at a work problem. And combine the math or the numbers to see exactly what they're doing. For example, adding the two numbers or the work times together, then dividing by 2. Or you have an individual who multiplies it, and then you have individuals who just look at the individual time itself. For example, they're saying, well, what if a person started at 9 o'clock, and then they'll start counting the time to see if that works. And it's, like I said, it's really great to take different approaches, but then it's also great to show them exactly how the math is usually applied, because then I show them in different examples, like you see on your screen, how to translate that information, not only for the work problem, but additional problems that they'll see in the future. And then I show that connection of not only what they're doing with the problem, how to design the problem, and not only to solve the problem, but how it relates to where in any and all situations, like in business or in engineering or in science, how it relates to that, so it doesn't become overwhelming. Germaine cognitive load for me is all about using the actual processing of the information and then using that information to help them organize it in the best way and have them to approach it to make that connection of where it looks at. So on the screen, you'll see an example of the work principle that we break it down for the students that I would do in the classroom so they can apply it, create the problem, the equation itself, and then also how it applies to different areas. And at this time in the conversation, I would ask students to not only use it in a real world scenario, but how they were related to other scenarios, such as in their other disciplines or even in their own personal experience. Can you go to the next screen, Kevin? And as Kevin is going to come back to you all and talk about the examples of how this actually works out. And again, like I said, it does actually apply to the cognitive load theory. But I also want to leave with you the following strategies that I do as well too. One, I tailor my lessons to not only look at their previous knowledge, but also look at the existing knowledge that they have. We use a lot of work examples that's bringing that real world experience into the classroom so they can see how it connects, not only saying that it works in the mathematics classroom, but how it connects in their other disciplines in the real world itself. I gradually increase that knowledge by using more of the proficiency of what the student has learned. Next, I will carry out simple instructions, because I don't believe in giving overwhelming instructions, because again, students don't really want to hear a lot of jargon. As you saw the example with Kevin using the example of writing a paper in this case, it's a lot, and most of the time for most students becomes they don't want to hear it, or they tune out and it becomes lost. Next, what I'll do as well too is I'll use essential information that I gather from my students, but also from the lesson itself to show that connection. And then simply using that information to present it not only orally, but also give them that written part like you saw before, because then we'll do the problem, but then also give them a short explanation as we're going along. And then last but not least, encourage students to use any and all type of visuals to bring in that connection and also to make it relevant, and then also to make it personal for themselves. And I believe in cognitive load theory, it is all about making the connection, making sure the instructions are concise, and then also giving that practice and feedback to the students so that they understand how the mathematics, or in this case, any discipline, because I'm mathematics, but any discipline or anything that they're learning and how it connects. So not only to remember it for the course, not only to remember it after graduating, but remember it for maybe lifetime as well too. Kevin?
Thank you, Tuan. So at this point, we've presented a lot of ideas. We want to pause again and see how this affects you guys. So what are your immediate thoughts or questions? What's resonating with you at this point? What have you heard so far today that you go, aha, I've done that, or I haven't done that, I should do that, I want to do that, or any other general questions that might come up at this point.
I actually have a question for Tuan.
Yes.
Tuan, I was.
Yes,
Tuan.
Yes, Rebecca.
Hey, Tuan.
Hi, Rebecca.
Tuan, what I wanted to know is when you had mentioned that the students are, you're looking at their previous knowledge and you have them give examples, and I loved how you said they're going to give different answers, not necessarily the ones that you want them to, but they're giving you that sort of thought process behind it. Have you formed any kind of idea of maybe patterns? Like, is there certain types of ways they're approaching the answer and that you teach differently to those types of answers? Have you seen any of that in the, before you get to the point of even teaching?
Excellent question. Yes, when I see within my students after that open conversation and the patterns that they're doing, then I'll show them examples, and when we have that conversation, that's why I said it's great when they give examples, and then I'll group those examples together to give a conversation of saying, okay, let's approach it this way and see if it works out mathematically and saying that. For another example, in this case, we are actually, if you've ever seen me in the quad, there has been an example where we're outside and we actually worked on something in the classroom, and based on those examples, we went outside in the quad area to actually see if it actually worked out, if the mathematics actually works. And then we'll come back and then I'll talk to them and then like, oh my God, yeah, this is how I approached it, but this is how mathematically you should approach it, because you're doing it more based off your knowledge rather than how the mathematics actually approaches. But still, Rebecca, to answer your question, yeah, I've done that to group it together. And I think it becomes entertaining, not only for the students, but for myself as well too, to say, yeah, we all do those things, but here's how you should work it out. And then they learn from that, if that helps.
That's awesome. Much. I love your example too.
Yeah, and all of you, it has happened before. If I have to go back in history, if any and all remember President Granada, at the time, I remember when she was walking with the board, and I was outside doing an experiment with my students where we were talking about, it was actually talking about geometry and how geometry is actually in life itself. So instead of talking about triangles and squares and circles, it's like, okay, let's actually see where they're in real life and how they are constructed, in the sense of if they're strong enough. And so we were talking about which one will be the strongest figure. Would a triangle be strong enough and it stands out and everyone sees it? Would a square or a parallelogram or even a rhombus, any of those figures? Because I figure rather than being in the classroom and talking about geometry, let's actually live geometry, because it's actually around the campus. So this brings up, when I was outside with my students, I gave them a short explanation of what we were doing, and my students are running around the campus looking for all these figures and explaining when they come back and saying this is how it structurally shows up, and talking about how the math works with it. And President Granada and the board members actually came over and saying, what are you doing? And I at the time I was laughing. I'm saying, I'm having my students live geometry, and she thought it was the hilarious thing in the world. So at that time, she was like, you're having them live geometry? I said, yes, because in the classroom we talked about how geometry is in the life form of buildings and everything that we do. So they're actually going around and testing the theory of how strong figures are in our society, which our campus has a ton of them. So that's my fondest memory when she came out and asked that question. The board thought I was crazy.
Well, that's so perfect to create those experiential learning moments, truly experiencing geometry. And in doing that, what you've also done is you've reduced that problem space, right? Like, here's our desired goal. Here's what we currently know how to do. And so you're trying to make those things connect. And so this is great evidence for these points on the screen right now of, as we've mentioned, measuring where students are at right now, doing a needs assessment. And that's a great way to start. Like, what do you already know about geometry? And it's not that they have to know a lot, but it's a way of getting them thinking about it. It's a way, of course, for you as the instructor to know what they already know. But students are starting to get into that zone, then reducing that problem space between their current skill set and the desired goal. We've mentioned already incorporating or reducing that split attention effect, but then also taking advantage of different ways in which we process memory, our working memory, auditory, right, and visual. And the auditory components have their own memory storage, if you will. So we should take advantage of that. And then to some of the other points that have been mentioned already as we move into our concluding, applying it to your practice stage, making connections, activating schema. Always begin by activating schema. What do learners already know about this subject matter? And so this is, as an instructional designer, as an instructor, you're always trying to scaffold that information and break it down. So maybe they don't know anything about advanced chemistry, but can we start with some really basic chemical, compounds that we use every day? And we never think about it, right? How do we use chemistry every day? And we're using chemistry every day. I'm not conscious that I'm doing it, but there's applicable ways that we can start and then move to our desired goal. Use routine, use ritual, starting class with a review, starting class with warm-up questions, right? Reviewing the previous week's knowledge is building on schema that students have just constructed. So you can add to that. Providing time in class. Remember that germaine cognitive load, students need to work through that. And as an instructor, you need to see evidence of that happening. So providing time in class and, walking around the campus and experiencing geometry is a way to approach it. Another way, of course, as well, I'm going to work all the problems on the board by myself. And then I'm going to give you the homework and say, open up to page 12. Now you go home and do the geometry. I'd much rather be with Tuan and going, okay, I'm going to walk around campus and practice understanding geometry. And then Tuan knows if I'm getting it or not, right? So providing time in class, being explicit about your instruction. And that's what the worked examples are all about, being explicit with the goal and the instruction. And then chunking. And so earlier in the presentation, we thought about bits of information and chunking information. And it's kind of a clunky term, but this used all the time, right? Chunking information. And so you do it when we go to the grocery store. Probably we make a list of dairy items that we need to buy, of vegetables or produce that we need to buy, of toiletries that we need to buy. Whatever, we group things. And so we want to do that with our instruction as well. We want to chunk information and we want to keep it brief. It doesn't mean you can't lecture or do anything more than 10 minutes, but it means present, stop, pause, what's going on, chunk information. Okay, present some more, stop and pause, what's going on, learners. And so Tuan and I were aware of that when we designed this presentation today, of presenting information, stopping, reflecting, how you guys doing? Okay, let's move on, present a little bit more, and then let's check in again. And, Tuan mentioned emotions as well, right? So when we start to get overwhelmed, we're not maybe aware what our brain is doing, but our brain is shutting down, or we are aware we're overwhelmed, so we stop, and then we get frustrated. And then we've now had a really negative experience learning statistics when the teacher was all about modeling how well he could work through equations because he's been doing it for 35 years. He's forgotten about the novice who's never done it before, who might need an hour or two to work through step number one, And so when you have those negative experiences, then it becomes a bad thing, and then that limits my learning. So we need to be aware of that as instructors. A few more really practical teaching tips, but open educational resources. I shared with you that visual of Gothic architecture compared to the textbook example. And so open educational resources really can help significantly in reducing the extraneous load that sometimes we inadvertently create as instructors. So that is something to strongly consider. Of course, making your course material available on smartphones, their iPads or tablets, because we know that the more students can watch the lectures, engage in the course content, the more familiar and more experiences they'll have with it. You know, another very useful strategy is putting quiz questions inside the lecture. You know, I used to give out study guides, and then I started just doing practice tests. And I found that, guess what? The whole practice test thing helped them significantly more than a study guide did, because the practice test actually gave them the experience of taking the test. It reduced that part of the anxiety over what is the test going to be like. They just started doing the practice tests, and they focused on the content more effectively than here's a study guide with all the content just listed. So, you know, putting those quiz questions right inside your instruction is useful. And Tuan mentioned also already the importance of limiting your assignments and just doing like one assignment really well, rather than trying to create 5 different assignments and maybe have them poorly executed. So these are the different terms that we learned about today. And then final check-in for any questions that you guys might have. Any final questions or comments or reactions? What about today's topic do you think you can apply to your instruction? What strategies did you learn that are useful in your instruction?
If I may add for all of you, one of the things I experience in this, especially with mathematics, is that most instructors will use the same handouts or the same materials, as Kevin was mentioning before. And I know some of us are very guilty in doing that. It's because it's easier. We just keep reusing the same thing over and over again. And as Rebecca was asking before about when students ask questions about word problems, and do I group them together? One of the things that I've learned as well too over my educational practices is that I use different materials all the time, because I always find out from my students about A, what type of learners they are, B, what things that will help them to understand the material, and C, as Kevin was mentioning before too, in regards to maybe using those materials on different types of media, so like iPads and phones and etc. I think those are very useful tools for all of you in doing that, because students always find some type of difficulty in not only reading the material of the same handouts that we use over and over and over again, and they may find no connection to it for themselves, and you really want them to be connected to the material so they can better understand it and also feel personable with it as well too. But it also keeps us abreast of what's going on, especially when we have students coming or transitioning from our ESL courses into our college courses as well too, and students who are foreign to the United States and taking classes, our international students, students with some type of learning disabilities, and then also students who at the college level, first generational students who never experienced these things. So all these factors we should consider when we are not only creating our material for our students, but also when we creating our lessons and actually the examples or assignments that you do as well too. You're absolutely correct, Mary. I wish that we could do a lot more streaming. I really do. That's an excellent choice.
You know, and with the streamlining, I know it's easy. I think a lot of the times I said I need to streamline the entire course. And that's an overwhelming thought sometimes. So streamlining a unit of instruction and, or streamlining the one activity, but the baby steps are really important steps to take. And so that is a really doable thing, that looking at the materials that we've used and, maybe, well, I've used it a lot and I know it works, but, why not try a new way of presenting that information? That makes a lot of sense. Any other ideas or suggestions that you have for applying cognitive load theory to your instruction?
Yes, Rebecca.
What, Tuan? I didn't raise my hand. My idea, though, if I were to add anything to it, I'm actually been working on streamlining my course. I think it's continuously doing it. I started about 8 years ago already, and every semester there's still something wrong. I call it wrong because like you just get to that point where one day of the semester you see 5 out of 25 students that are completely lost. And with me, if it's even that small of an amount, I know I've got to tweak it in some way. But I think that the biggest thing is we're teaching a different generation now. The Zs are moving in. They're more technologically savvy, but it seems like even though they know how to use the technology, they don't know how to cognitively apply it. So that's what I'm working on. And this kind of definition of the idea of cognitive load, and I love keeping it real and applicable like Tuan does, but it is just ongoing in my mind.
You're right. You're right, Rebecca. It's something that it's never going to end. And I say in the sense of end because you're right, you're going to get a different type of students every semester. You're going to get a different type of learner. And you're right, they come in with these technological skills, not knowing how to apply them correctly. I know, for example, I've talked about in my class how to email at the college level. And I know we all laugh about that, but most students don't because they don't know how to actually email college professors or email their instructors to ask questions. And I give an example. On the first day, I received an email from a student saying, what do I need to bring to class? And I wrote back to the student with his name and said, thank you for your email. Please explain what you mean. Because then the student came to class, he said, well, I meant, do I need to bring a pencil or paper? And I'm like, well, you realize reading your email replies to it. To me, I didn't know what you're really talking about. I said it could have related to several different things. You said what to bring. I said, I could have said bring a car or bring your mother, bring your spouse, bring a cupcake. I said, without me knowing exactly what you're referring to, I could reply that to many different ways. And if you send it to the wrong person, they may send you back some information you don't want to hear. And he was like, oh, I didn't know that. Yes, it's not the same. I said, it's not like you have to really define everything that you're talking about. But when someone reads another person's email, without knowing how to interpret it, especially if I've never met you, I wouldn't know how to reply to that. So you're right, they come in with all these different skills, and now we're teaching or trying to guide them in a direction that you're not only at the college level, but it's also going to be worked into your life, where you're going to be doing it outside the classroom with your colleagues who are going to be at the same job or in your career, and etc. This is now the time to learn those skills. And yeah, it's not something that you like, it's right, it's ongoing, because I'm thinking in my mind, do I really have to explain to a student how to email? But sometimes it does happen. You have to explain to them what to put in the subject line, how to structure an email with a salutation. and a body and a conclusion, especially when I tell them the conclusion is saying thank you or sincerely or cheers. Use some type of closing rather than bye. You know, and I'm like, uh, I always have to laugh about it in class because I always use the example of when we didn't have students use their Triton email accounts, and I say, well, I received an email, and I'll show it on the board as well too, from a student who said, I'm not going to be in class. I said, please pay attention to the email address, and the email address was Big Ass Booty 2. I'm like, I have no idea who to address this email to. And you're right, Rebecca, everyone laughs at that, but I'm like, this is an appropriate email, for one. Two, who is this? and then in class, I say, you know what? If I have to ask all of you your names and email, I say, I'll just do it like this. Everyone stand up, turn around, let me see who has a big ass booty too, so then I know who to address it. And we all laugh about that, but it's to show them that email etiquette is very important. And this is not texting your friends. This is not on your phone texting your part-time or full-time or whomever. You are addressing this in a professional manner. It needs to stay that way. So choose a different email. But now we use our Triton email. So yeah, that's my favorite email. And to today, for all of you, that person did come to Triton. So it was just a hilarious email, but I would never reveal the person's name. But I use that as an example of saying, this is how I really want your emails to be addressed when you're sending me a question. And the other thing too, especially with now we coming back to campus and using from COVID, now we have to show our students the different ways of how this is going to be addressed on campus as well too. So you're right, Rebecca, it's not something that is going to stop. We're forever learning as instructors. We're forever learning how to deal with students. We're forever learning how to apply these skills, not only in the classroom to our students, but how we have to better ourselves as well too. All right, so like I'll tell my students, I'll get off the platform and it's now time for you. All right. I guess this is my part of saying we're at the 3:30 hour for all of you. On behalf of any other questions? Thank you, Kevin. Okay. On behalf of Kevin and I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for attending our presentation. Stay motivated for all of you. Stay diligent to what you do well and what we do best, but also be appreciative to our students that come in who teach us how to become better educators. Thank you.